This Italian university tradition can tell us quite a lot about the phonetic history of the Romance languages in general. In this video, I want to continue our little series on how the different Romance languages adapted Latin's consonant clusters and how we can use this to identify more or less the contours of the phonetic shape of the Romance languages in general. I want to start this off with Spanish. If you are familiar with Latin and speak Spanish, you'll notice a very common pattern. Latin words that begin with the sibilant plosive consonant cluster sp or st tend to add an e in Spanish at the beginning. So, for example, spiritus is spirit in Latin, but spirit in Spanish is espíritu. We have spatium in Latin, but espacio in Spanish. This also seems to be the case with Portuguese, by the way. Sterilis is the Latin adjective sterile. In Spanish, it's estéril. And it's also something similar, estéril, in Portuguese. Now, this addition of a sound at the beginning of a word that didn't have that sound beforehand is called prosthesis in linguistics. And Spanish is a language full of prosthesis, as we've just seen. But Italian, funnily enough, isn't. If we look at the examples I've just given you, espacio in Spanish is spazio in Italian. Espíritu in Spanish, but spirito in Italian. And it goes on and on. Espada is spada. Esperanza, speranza. What's going on here? Well, we might want to conclude from this that Spanish and Portuguese are just peculiarly prone to prosthesis, if you pardon the plosives there. But it's actually not quite that simple. Yes, certainly, if we compare modern Spanish and modern Portuguese with modern standardized Italian, we might be excused for reaching that conclusion. But if we broaden our scope a little bit more, there's a much more interesting pattern that becomes salient. You see, French also has lots of prosthesis. It's just not as evident because a lot of the time the prosthesis is accompanied with the loss of accompanying consonants, usually S. For example, this is why you have estudiante in Spanish but étudiant in French. Extranjero in Spanish but étranger in French. And even with Italian, if we broaden our scope there, we see that Italian was not immune from prosthesis at all. Here are two really interesting examples. The one is from the anonymous Novellino. We'll see here that the modern Italian adjective stesso is rendered as istesso in medieval Tuscan. And look at this late 13th century poem by Monte Andrea that opens with non isperate, Ghebellin soccorso. This command form, isperate, indicates that the noun form for hope that Monte Andrea and his contemporaries were using was esperanza, a lot like the modern Spanish esperanza. So Italian actually seems to be the exception here. Modern standardized Italian seems to have, through artifice, through the construction of the modern standard, removed a lot of the examples or a lot of the instances of prosthesis that previously existed. But that isn't to say that prosthesis has been removed entirely by the processes of standardization in modern Italian. It's highly unlikely that that kind of thing could easily happen anyway. Something always slips through the cracks. And one of the things that has slipped through the cracks is the word for this, the corona d'alloro. When Italian students graduate university, they usually don this laurel wreath. It's sort of the local equivalent of the cap and gown in other traditions. But when you hear that word, corona d'alloro, your Latin senses should be tingling, because alloro, the noun form in Italian, isn't the same as the Latin. The Latin has no A. It's laurus in Latin. That's actually, by the way, where we get the idea of being a poet laureate from. You're a poet who has been crowned with laurel wreaths. English, of course, as you've just seen in that example, doesn't add the A. So the corona d'alloro, so closely associated with Italian academic culture, seems to be a vestige of medieval prosthesis in the Italian language, which, as we said, was much more widespread than is evident today in modern standard Italian. So I want to thank you for watching this video. Did you find anything new and interesting about this? Have you got any interesting comments about the phenomenon of prosthesis in Romance languages that you'd like to share with me down below? Perhaps if it's a broad enough topic, I might be able to cover it in a following video. I want to thank you very much for watching again and say arrivederci. Ciao.